This is the story of British cannibal killer David Harker, who butchered a mother of 4 and boasted he'd eaten her flesh.
The way that Julie's body was dealt with and the parts of the body disposed of made this particularly horrendous.
It was a crime that shocked the country and left a trail of human devastation in its wake, as David Harker played out a personal fantasy to be Britain's youngest serial killer.
You could clearly see on the top of the sack the shoulder blades of a human being.
In February 1995, David Harker, a would-be musician, arrived in Darlington. He'd been in and out of trouble in his hometown of Chester-le Street, and he hoped for a new start. It wasn't long before he'd made a large group of young friends. Matt Farey was 16 when he fell in with 23-year-old David.
He used to just come round and like have his dinner and stuff like that with us, and he got on with my mum and my sister and things, so when he said he had nowhere to stay, we just let him stay for a bit, and it just ended up being longer than we expected.
Harker was the nicest bloke I'd ever met. First thing I noticed was his eyes, big eyes, blue eyes. He was always the centre of attention with his bottle of White Star.
Matt's sister Janet was 11 when she got friendly with David.
When David was living at mine, he wasn't paying any rent or anything, and my mum didn't mind because he was paying us really in his kindness. Like, he was always doing his bit, you know, cleaning up, tidying up, helped me with my homework. He was always trying to help me because he said he didn't want me to turn out like him.
Things were really looking up for David Harker when he met and fell in love with a local girl, and they moved into a flat in Harewood Grove, in one of Darlington's pretty residential areas. After a year of domestic bliss, Harker's relationship fell apart, and his girlfriend moved out.
He turned to the drink then a lot more. He was always sat in the park. Wherever he was, he'd have his White Star, he'd have his drink, and he made him feel better, so he said, but I think it made him worse.
It was at this point that Harker met Julie Paterson, a woman who would change his life forever. 31-year-old Julie had a string of childhood tragedies and had recently lost her 3 children in a custody battle. This trauma had led her to a reliance on Valium and alcohol.
I got to know Julie 3 years before the incident happened. First as a lodger, and then she became a friend. She was bubbly and she was happy. She liked to drink, but when she was depressed, you know, she went from an extrovert to an introvert.
Within weeks of arriving in Darlington, Julie met Alan Taylor, with whom she was to have a 3-year relationship.
Alan was always a loner, always on his own. But he was a happy chap, and he liked to drink, and he really, really loved her. We had the ups and downs and arguments, just like any other couple. But it was the first time he'd ever, like, been with anybody for a long time. And it was nice.
We had our ways of, like, pulling out of difficult times, and that's just making each other laugh. We did. Good style. We haven't had the straightforward life. We have had some obstacles to jump over, you know. It was difficult for us both.
From time to time, the Darlington Park drinking fraternity would up sticks to Hastings. Alan and Julie couldn't wait to move to the seaside, as it promised a new start.
And then she fell pregnant. When she was pregnant with Alan's baby. But they took themselves off to Hastings. They were going to have a new life with a new baby, you know, and they were going to do everything differently. And I don't know what happened there, but they put the baby up for adoption. I don't know if it was through choice or if it was social services choice, you know, for that to happen. And then they came back. I wish to God they'd never come back.
Julie's circumstances were deteriorating. The adoption of her 4th child had left her depressed and withdrawn.
She arrived one night, I can't remember when, it was just after they came back from Hastings, crying because she missed her baby. But she never ever explained why it was up for adoption And of course, you don't like to ask because it's, you know, it's prying into her personal life, really.
It was difficult for us both, actually. But I didn't show it as much as what Julie did. Julie just seemed lost. Just give up.
She was upset. And when Julie got upset, she done silly things, you know. She was depressed. And she wasn't a very strong character. She would take pills if she was depressed.
Throughout Julie's relationship with Alan, she regularly disappeared for days on end, with no explanation.
She'd go to Durham, or she'd just disappear. We didn't know where she went, but she would just appear back again. Dirty, hair not combed, and she'd just have a bath and a meal and a good sleep, and then she was back to normal the next day.
There's been many times she'll get up, she'll say, I'm just going to the toilet, and that would be Julie disappeared. It'd been for a day, maybe it's 3 days. The most was a week. Confused she was.
She did make herself vulnerable because she would end up being with people who were also on the streets. And I mean, let's face it, today, who is on the streets?
April the 6th, it was a Monday, and there'd been a clip on the telly, and it was for Coronation Street, where a young girl had been taken by this, like, religious group, obviously getting brainwashed, and she lost her bairn. And when it came on the clip, Julie said, oh, she thinks she's the only one who's lost her bairn. And that's when she went up. Whoosh, the whole lot went.
The night Julie Paterson walked out on her lover, Alan Taylor, was the start of a living nightmare for her family and friends, and the beginning of a horror story that shook the quiet town of Darlington.
This all began really with Alan Taylor coming into Darlington Police Office and reporting his partner, Julie Paterson, missing. He did that on the 29th of April, 1998. He said that Julie had actually been missing for about 3 weeks before he'd come in and reported her. He said that she had gone missing on previous occasions, and he thought that this might be another time when she'd gone away just really to gather her thoughts, and that she would turn up safely again. But he'd become increasingly worried as the time had gone on.
Like all the other times, just waited till she came back, and obviously, like, started looking when she hadn't come back. She had various appointments which she had to keep each week. One being picking up a Valium, 2, seeing her daughter, Social Security for counter payments. I'm there, turned up, no Julie. I really started to worry when Julie hadn't turned up for her eldest daughter's appointment, because Julie would not miss that.
After disappearing, Julie had, in fact, met David Harker.
I think it was must have been about the beginning of April when I seen them together. My mum came in and said, oh, I think Harker's got a new girlfriend. I said, oh yeah. She looked like, she said, quite small, blonde hair. She said, I've just seen them on Duke Street. I said, all right. And then that was in about tea time, about 5 o'clock, and then about 7 o'clock I went walking through here, and he was sat where I'm sat now, on this bench, and she was sat next to him, and that's when I met them. And they were drunk, the pair of them, having a giggle. She was just as drunk as he was, but they were wanting more. And I didn't have any money, so I couldn't give it to them. And just about normal things, and then she gave me a hug, and Harker gave me a hug, and then I left and went to meet my friends.
I was concerned that here we had a very vulnerable person who had been missing for apparently 4 weeks at the point when this matter was brought to my attention. and no one had seen her in that time. We decided to go to the newspapers on the Thursday of that week because the inquiries that had been done had still not been able to locate Julie. So really what we wanted to do was publish Julie's photograph because she was of a very distinctive appearance with a blonde hair.
As the police had hoped, Julie's photo in the newspaper jogged someone's memory, and a witness called in with startling information.
He recognised Julie straight away as being a person that he'd seen before, and immediately linked that to a conversation that he'd had with David Harker.
The witness told the police to look down Polham Lane, a quiet, secluded lane in Darlington. Detective Inspector Ian Phillips was sent to investigate.
When I arrived at the scene, which would be 2:30 in the morning, 2:45, obviously I'd been told of a phone call. So by the time I'm here, the lane's closed off, both at the top, up past the football ground, down the bottom. It's all taped off. There's an officer about 50 feet in front of me. He is a dog man. And on my request, some 20 minutes earlier, I'd asked him to search Polham Lane on the evidence that we had. So as I'm walking up here, I'm thinking, obviously, what have we got? The dog has given a positive indication that there's something in the undergrowth. He leads me to an area. Once there, I find on the floor a sack. It looks like a Hessian sack. It's 3 feet long and at the most 2 feet wide. But to the physical eye, even with torchlight, it's very difficult to see what it is. The one noticeable thing to me immediately, that there was a very, very strong smell. At that particular time, the elderly occupant of the cottage came round to the front asking what was going on, and I asked her if she knew anything about the sack that was lying in the undergrowth, and she said to me, she says, "Don't worry, son, it's been there a couple of weeks and it's a dead dog," but there was just something about it. So I said, right, we'll wait until we get some light, some decent light, and I just had to be certain. So I decided to wait. You can imagine this lane. There's nothing moves. You know, by this time it's 3 o'clock in the morning. There's nothing. There's no traffic. There's nothing anywhere near this place. It's eerie. It is eerie. Stood out here for half an hour, waiting for a bit of light. I don't think there was a word spoke. The first light came within seconds. Knew what I was dealing with. You could clearly see on the top of the sack the shoulder blades of a human being. Just put everybody into very deep shock. And that shock lasted for a few seconds before you gather yourself and then realise, well, this is a dead body. It's obviously been badly mutilated. This person has been murdered, butchered, and we've got a job on our hands.
I was notified by the detective inspector who'd organised the search that they thought they had found the remains of a body, and I went to the scene at around about 5:30 that morning.
I can still recall my very words were, gentlemen, I know you've got to go and have a look, but prepare yourselves. This is something horrible. This is something that I've never seen. It's something that you'll have never seen. And I'm very sorry, but we have an awful, awful murder to deal with.
Shockwaves went through Darlington, and Darlington's a decent small town, an old Quaker town, railway town. It wasn't the kind of place where gruesome murders happened. You know, the murders in Darlington are very few and far between. This one was different. This one was a girl, a young woman, dismembered, body in a bag, in a garden of a derelict house, in a nice area of town.
As I was driving down to attend the scene that morning, the thoughts that were running through my mind were that we'd been looking for Julie. We were all very concerned and hoping to find Julie safe and well. And I was really dreading the thought that the remains that had been found might be Julie, and that she was dead and that she'd been murdered.
There was a massive amount of public interest and just shock. You know, who could have done this in this town? And how could this happen? This isn't, you know, Merseyside, this isn't Tyneside, it's not inner city. And what's going on? You know, who have we got living in here? Was he local? Could he have possibly been local?
Alarmingly, more and more calls are coming in from local kids, reporting a bizarre tale of murder and mutilation that David Harker, an unemployed wannabe musician, had been telling for some weeks. However, no one had believed him.
Harker used to tell us stories in funny voices about how he was going to take us down dark, secluded alleyways and kill us and that, but we used to just laugh it off, you know what I mean, think it was funny.
Harker always used to call himself Devil Man. So he'd stand up on the bench and scream, "I'm going to rot in hell, so's everyone else, because I am Devil Man." And that was him. He'd get his attention from saying he was Devil Man. And I used to find it amusing, I used to laugh at him. He used to always say it again, say it again.
On the afternoon of the 18th or 19th, I saw David Harker in Stanhope Park, and he boasted about how he'd chopped up Julie, dumped the body in Paulham Lane, and the limbs and the head went out with the rubbish. Obviously he was drunk, so I just passed it off, didn't believe him.
He told over 20 people about what he'd done. No one would believe what he'd done, to the point where he was even saying, "I'll tell you where I've left the body, or you can come back to the flat and I'll show you the evidence." What began to emerge when we were talking to the friends and associates of Harker was that they were all very much younger than he was, and that Harker had been quite a dominant figure in that group of people, that he was always out to impress them, to shock them.
The police, fearing the killer would strike again, lost no time tracking down the man who by now had become their #1 suspect, David Harker.
Harker, at the time, was living in a bail hostel. He'd appeared at court earlier in that week in connection with an offence of robbery, and the circumstances of that particular offence were someone who had just blown, really, and used extreme violence.
2 officers were charged with the task of bringing Harker in for questioning. They didn't know what to expect.
When we first saw David Harker, I mean, he's quite a big guy. I mean, he was 6'3", quite well built. He had very, very short, almost shaved hair, and he had 2 tattoos on his head. He had subhuman written on one side and disorder written on the other side of his head. And just that appearance would, you know, you would look at him and think, whoa, he looks like he could be a handful.
There was no questions asked by himself, and he quite freely came back with us. The first 2 interviews that we had with David Harker, he was more than happy and willing to talk to us about his version of events. He even went into detail that yes, he had met a girl, He denied that her name was Julie, and he gave her the name Roxanne. We allowed him to tell us his version of events, and in that scenario he was very comfortable in talking to us. It was only until the end of the second interview, I believe it was, where he became a little bit agitated and worried, and then he started complaining that he heard voices in his head, and these voices were telling him what to do.
Whilst Harker's interviews continued, a team of police officers and forensic scientists were investigating his flat, number 6A, Harewood Grove.
I remember going into the backyard there. The mood of the team was one of trepidation, really. I think that was probably the best way to describe it. We really didn't know what we were going to find when we opened the door. My worst fears were confirmed as soon as we opened the door and we saw what appeared to be the trail of blood leading from a cupboard underneath the stairs. That was consistent with a body being dragged from the cupboard out and along the passageway to the room at the end of the passageway, which was a cellar-type room and had shuttered windows, and really was quite eerie and macabre when we went into that room. We found items of clothing which seemed to correspond to items that Julie had been wearing. There was a pair of tracksuit bottoms there, I remember. What we found was, in most of the rooms, was either property belonging to Julie or evidence that Julie had been there. We went into the kitchen of the house, and on a shelf in the kitchen were a pair of training shoes that later, it turned out, were Julie's. When we later went into Harker's bedroom, there was heavy blood staining in the corner of the bedroom. Scientists later told us that that was consistent with a part of Julie's body having been in that corner and blood having soaked through the carpet into the floorboards below. There were a number of what appeared to us initially to be poems. We didn't know the significance of some of those words, but they appeared to us to be very significant. Also on the wall there was one word which was becoming, which also was written on a knife that we later found in the garage of the house, where we found a blood-stained blanket in a plastic sack. I can remember a feeling of sadness, really. I think I regarded it as almost inevitable that this is where the murder had taken place. And I knew that the circumstances for Julie must have been frightening.
In the sleepy town of Darlington, the mutilated body of a woman has been discovered. Local mother of 4, Julie Paterson, has been missing for 4 weeks, and the police fear the worst. On searching suspect David Harker's flat, police discover gruesome evidence linking him to her death.
Julie Paterson's father, brother and sister-in-law entering court this morning to see David James Harker make his first appearance on the charge of murder. David James Harker was led into the courtroom in handcuffs for his own protection and because of the serious nature of the offence. He was flanked by security, and other police officers wearing protective jackets guarded the rest of the courtroom. No bail was requested.
not to have arms, legs and a head. It just, you know, it just couldn't be Julie. I was violently sick. In fact, I think we all were. It was just a horrendous thing.
The whole focus of the case was turned on David Harker and what he'd done and how gruesome the murder was. But the more I delved into Julie's life and Harker's life and the people that she knew, the more I realised was that she was actually a really nice person. Nobody said anything bad about her. Nobody. I knew she'd had problems in her life and issues, which ultimately, you know, led her to become reliant upon Valium and drink, but I think she had a really good heart.
I was completely shocked that he'd actually done it, and I was disgusted that he did it. I just didn't know really what to think at first. It took a while to sink in. I was obviously felt for her family, felt for him for being such a bloody idiot. Thought he shouldn't have done it, and then basically all I could do was help the police and get him locked up, really. Didn't want him walking around the streets, didn't want him doing it again.
Despite having boasted endlessly to his friends about the murder and mutilation of Julie, Harker now vehemently denied any knowledge of it. He refused to reveal to the police where the missing parts of Julie's body were. Durham Constabulary now launched the biggest inquiry they'd ever carried out in a desperate attempt to find the rest of Julie's remains.
This was us versus Mr. Harker, right? We wanted to find those parts. We wanted to find them for the family's sake and to give Julie some respect as well.
The police had to start their search somewhere. The only leads they had were the often contradictory boasts Harker had made to his friends.
He told people he'd put the head down a drain. He told other people he'd thrown the rest of the body in the river. He told other people that he'd disposed of the arms and the legs by putting it out in domestic waste.
We were publishing stories in the days following that, asking people to check their bins, to check their gardens, their outhouses. Really pretty gruesome stuff.
We searched around the find. We took the search out to a mile. We searched all the parklands, we searched all the ponds, we did the drains, we had cameras down drains, and we were actually looking down all the sewage systems.
And then I think really the most macabre twist came when the police said, well, we've not found anything in the town. We have to search the rubbish tip.
A 50-strong team of police officers were dispatched to the local rubbish tip, Coxo Tip, one of the largest landfill sites in Europe.
It's quite awesome to drive into this massive hole in the ground. And basically in the distance, I could see the two police carriers, right? And there were specks in the distance. And you could hardly make out the officers because of the enormous size of this huge hole in the ground.
Despite the overwhelming size of the task, the police team searched around the clock.
To open a bag, and you know it's Darlington because it's got a Darlington address on an envelope. And the house is maybe 2 streets away from the murder scene. And in that same bag, you find a newspaper dated 17th, 18th, 19th of April. If anybody found that, it was like, this is it, this is it. Come on, we're in the right. We know this is the refuse being collected from that area on those specific dates.
Over the 3-week search, the police sifted 20,000 tons of rubbish. But despite their best efforts, the whereabouts of Julie's body parts remained a mystery, and the search had to be abandoned.
I still believe to this day that certainly parts of Julie are on that landfill site. I firmly believe that.
On July the 24th, Julie was finally buried.
Well, because Julie's parts haven't been found, the funeral was a funeral, but with a big difference. There wasn't enough of her for the, you know, to be a burial, to be a funeral. She'll never be at rest. None of us will be at rest until they find all the other parts, put them together and bury her properly. That's when she'll be at rest.
There's only a torso down there. The rest of Julie's not there. It does my head in.
For Julie's boyfriend, Alan Taylor, it was a tormenting time.
I hope she doesn't think she's done anything wrong, because she hasn't. I mean, we're all going to end up in a place like that, but that should never have been, should it? It's wrecked my life. At rest. How can she be at rest? She's not even all there. Yeah, she's in the arms of God, but she's still somewhere.
David Harker still refused to admit to the crime, despite the overwhelming forensic evidence linking him to Julie's death.
Some weeks into the inquiry, Harker's solicitor had applied for him to be assessed psychiatrically, and Harker was transferred from prison to Ashworth Hospital for that assessment. Almost immediately, he began to repeat the stories that he had told to his friends and associates.
Prior to his arrest, Harker had boasted to over 20 friends about his ambitions to be a serial killer, and told of how he had killed his first victim, Julie Paterson.
Harker seemed desperate to tell his story and wanted to be known as the youngest serial killer in Britain.
During his time at Ashworth Psychiatric Unit, Harker claimed to have killed 2 other people, but the police found no evidence to substantiate this. Harker continued to make outrageous allegations about Julie's death. He told psychiatrists that after he'd killed Julie, he had cut off a part of her thigh and cooked it with garlic butter and pasta.
Silence the Lambs and things like that, it was always, I could be in that, but as Devil Man, I'd do a better job, I'd be Devil Man. Just everything he was Devil Man. If he could murder somebody, he could eat somebody. The fact that somebody so close to me could murder somebody and eat flesh, whatever, it makes me feel sick.
Harker's claims made front-page news, and he seemed to have achieved his goal of becoming a famous cannibal killer, like his hero, the American cannibal killer, Jeffrey Dahmer.
I think a particularly upsetting part of this case was that Harker had claimed that he'd actually eaten part of Julie's body. There has never been any evidence to confirm that that was the case. It is only Harker's claim. And again, our feeling was that he was making that claim in order to try and sensationalise what he'd done.
Harker didn't stop at cannibalism. He also tried to convince staff at Ashworth that he'd indulged in necrophilia and that he was creating a mask out of the skin of his victims. Again, no evidence of this was ever found, and police began to suspect that he was fueling his fantasies from the plots of well-known films.
He seemed to be desperate to somehow impress people with what he was saying. And at the time, I know that he was trying to contact newspapers and try and convince them that they should write a book about him.
His motivation was notoriety. He wanted to be famous. He wanted me to write a book. But that was never something I was interested in, partly because I didn't want to give him his wish. And so I'm sure that he's quietly happy with the notoriety he's received. He did only kill one person, but his trump card is the fact that he's never said where her remains are, and I think he won't do that because he knows that it's keeping him in the press.
Whilst Harker was at Ashworth, he started a letter-writing campaign with the Northern Echo newspaper.
I think what's interesting in the letters is that Harker has portrayed himself as the victim. He doesn't talk about Julie Paterson at all.
Harker makes outrageous allegations in his letters about his parents, all of which are untrue.
From the age of 2 years until I was 16 or so, I was beaten on a regular basis by my father, sometimes for no reason other than that he was high. At the age of 6, I first attempted suicide at school by trying to hang myself on a skipping rope. At the age of 10, I was forced to watch a dogfight my father held at home, then to clean blood and flesh afterwards, but because I used the wrong type of cloth to do it, I was beaten.
The person with the psychopathic disorder will feel very strongly that they have been treated badly because they are basically very selfish. They will highlight all the injustices that have been done to them throughout their life.
My mother was disabled. I was forced to do housework to her specifications, and if not, she told lies to my father, who would then resolve it with a beating.
So often in cases of this kind, they describe a disturbed childhood. Now, this could simply mean that they were awkward children, because the characteristics of the psychopath are apparent as a conduct disorder very early in life. So this makes them very difficult to manage at school and at home.
When I was 16 is when it all began, but you don't want to know why I'm becoming, because I don't shout it out plainly. If you have a friend at the police, ask them what was written on my bedroom wall when they searched it.
Harker clearly thought that he had the right to take another human being's life, and that he was superior to other people, and that by taking the person's life, that somehow he would become more powerful.
He was always saying, "I'm born again with snake's eyes, becoming God's size." And I asked him where he got it from, and apparently it's from this song, Becoming, that Pantera song. The whole time he was saying it, before the murder, he was always saying, I didn't understand. I just thought it was just a song that he liked. And now, when I think about it, he wants to be famous, he wants to be better than everyone, almighty, better than God, so that's probably what it means.
He was a rather typical example of the psychopath who is also a sadistic killer. He fitted the various criteria going back through his early life, the nasty things he did as a child, the kicking a dog to death, for example. These are all the features of the psychopath and someone who gets pleasure from torture and killing.
In Harker's 5th and final letter to the Northern Echo, he wrote,
I'm not evil, but I am a monster. The detectives that questioned me were too stupid to realize what I was.
He wanted us to think of him as a good guy. He wanted people to believe that Julie was trash. He wanted to be known as a monster. He wanted to be kind of a good monster. He would not accept that he was an absolutely terrifying, despicable killer.
As well as the letters, Harker sent the Northern Echo a riddle, hinting at where Julie's body parts might be.
You never told me if you liked riddles, but I'll tell you one anyway. The title for the riddle is Churchill. I own a bank, but have no money. I have falls, but keep going. I have a mouth, but do not eat. I have a bed, but do not sleep. I have a beginning, but have no end. What am I? Do you know where it is? I own a bank, but have no money. I have falls, but keep going. I have a mouth, but do not eat.
In a game of cat and mouse, cannibal killer David Harker wrote a riddle for the police, teasing them as to the whereabouts of Julie Paterson's head and limbs.
Do you know where it is?
I've got to say that we knew what the riddle was about almost immediately. It referred to a local village and a river running through that village. We searched the river very thoroughly in that area. All the indications are that the parts of the body were disposed of in another way, and we believe that that's what did happen.
Despite the absence of a complete body, police took Harker to trial for his gruesome crime. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility.
In sentencing him to life, the judge said that Harker had killed Julie Paterson in the most terrible circumstances, and that he had glorified in her death and in the manner of her death. He said that he had shown no remorse, and that given the slightest opportunity, he was sure that Harker would kill again.
The psychiatrists who examined Harker agreed that although he was in full control of his actions when he killed Julie, his total lack of remorse showed an absence of conscience which put him in the top 4% of psychopaths in Britain.
We don't feel very well, still. It's terrible. On account why he's not saying what he's done with the rest of my daughter's remains for a start. That's the main thing we want in it, Michael. Remains to be found.
If Harker had any decency within him, if he had anything in him, he would have let somebody know.
Losing his lover in such circumstances tormented Julie's boyfriend, Alan Taylor. For years, he carried on the search for her missing body parts.
Julie is somewhere around here, I know she is.
He would walk around Darlington in the parks and things with a spade, dig holes looking for her, because they never found her remains. Her limbs and her head are still missing now, and Harker has never said where they are. And I don't think he ever got to grips with that.
The crime of the cannibal killer had further repercussions no one could have foreseen.
The nightmares I have is actually, in a way, I'm like a murderer myself, because I have to think how he's maybe done it. You can imagine the emotional nightmares I do have. Honestly, I wouldn't wish them upon anybody.
8 years after Julie's death, and still consumed by grief and an alcohol problem, Alan Taylor murdered his friend John Morrison after an early morning drinking session.
Well, it was a very tidy scene, I suppose you could call it, with unfortunately Mr. Morrison lying on the settee within the house, and he was just laid on the settee, having been strangled, and there was a belt laid to one side.
When arrested, Taylor told police he wanted to be sent to Wakefield Prison so he could get to Harker.
When Alan Taylor was arrested on suspicion of murdering John Morrison, he launched into an attack on David Harker and said, "I can get to Harker now, I want to go to Wakefield Prison, this is unfinished business." And I think it was used in mitigation in court, as that was one of his reasons for killing John Morrison.
In March 2007, Alan Taylor was sentenced to life for John Morrison's murder. 3 months later, he took his own life in prison.
Alan Taylor did tragically commit suicide in prison, and he did leave a suicide note. Alan did refer to Julie in the suicide note, acknowledging Julie and the fact that he's now, or would be now, at peace, basically.
I think that if Julie hadn't been murdered, John Morrison would probably still be alive, purely because Alan's life might have maybe gone a different direction. He might not have met John Morrison, or the circumstances, he might just not have been in that situation.
9 years after David Harker killed Julie Paterson, David Jones, now a chief superintendent, no nearer to closing the case. Harker is still an inmate at Wakefield, the UK's largest maximum security prison, home to 700 of the country's most dangerous men. Harker has kept his silence and has even refused to see any visitors.
As far as I know, Harker's never shown any remorse. Over that period of time, I think there have been intermittent attempts by the family to make contact with Harker, but as far as I'm aware, he's never responded to any of those certainly in a positive way. And as far as I'm aware, no one has ever visited him in prison to talk to him directly about it.
It has become a matter of pride for Chief Superintendent Jones to bring closure to the case.
Certainly in my career, it was an outstanding case. I retire shortly, and it's always been my intention, before doing that, to go and see Harker and ask him to confirm what we think did happen, so that we can, give Julie's family some peace and some settlement on this finally.
To date, David Harker still refuses to reveal what he did with Julie Paterson's missing body parts. He can be considered for parole in 2012, 13 years after killing Julie.
And that was the last in the series. Tomorrow on 5, The Real Price of a Diamond. Blood Diamonds, the true story, is here at 8.